Good morning. Welcome once again to this module of NPTEL, where we are going to discuss many things on introduction to trade theories. We are now on the 5th lecture of first week, where we are supposed to understand further clarities on theories of trade and a clear introduction to it as well. While we discuss the introduction to trade theory, it is our steps to understand what, why and for whom trade. This is very important to derive through theories. So, in order to understand trade theories, we must actually try to capture some of the basic background of statistics, which we discussed in the last 2 lectures. Within another 2-3 minutes, we are supposed to understand another history to trade patterns. Late 1800 century, where we if we just try to observe the trade patterns over the history till the late 1800, it was relatively high rise in world trade. Till the 1800 we observed there was evidences there were evidences of high rise in trade. Whereas between 1890 and 1950, due to many cycles in trade and many macroeconomic cycles, actually the countries are expressed in number of restrictions, which has caused less open to world trade. And especially in post World War II, increasing openness was again observed majorly due to technological advances, and also due to the prescription of many topmost organizations in the world, like GATT, which was formed in 1947, prescribes reduction in trade barriers. So, this has caused actually for further openness in trade, especially in after World War II. So, again the importance for trade actually increased by 50% during the past century. If I just try to understand again the patterns of trade, we majorly witnessed shift in patterns, shift in terms of raw materials and agricultural products, especially for Indian exports, Indian cases. Due to Green Revolution period, from 1970s onwards for Indian case, but world as a whole 1990s onwards we have experienced agriculture products and raw materials exports and imports. Similarly, the manufacturing goods and the contribution of services are observed in the today's trade patterns. Now, how to understand trade theories as an anecdotal observation to the understanding of trade theories? We must try ourselves to imbibe certain knowledge on some sort of confusions, some sort of ambiguities in international trade. So, these are put here as fallacies of international trade for some kind of confusion, so that if you ask yourself, further concepts can be understood better. So, the first aspects of confusion is it a zero sum game activities? Now, the classical theories, not exactly the classical, before classical mercantilism believed that it is a zero sum game activity. So, trade is beneficial to some at the cost of losses for others, which was actually later on counteracted and refused by other theorists. There is not zero sum game, all can gain simultaneously. Now, another fallacy is, and also a myth in international trade discussion, which says that imports reduce employment and act as a drag on economy, whereas export actually enhance growth and employment, which is not true. If in many developing countries context, imports actually helps in bringing various know-hows, various raw materials, also minimize cost of productions because of lots of possibility of comparative advantages. Now, that is the fallacy also rejected by many other economists in the later part of their theories. Similarly, tariff quotas and other import restrictions save jobs and also promote employment is not necessarily true always. Tariff and quota may be a restriction, may be a facilitator for some countries, may create trade, may divert trade. So, therefore, just by attaching information on tariff and quotas which will promote higher growth is not necessarily true. We are supposed to verify it. Now, here what I wanted to discuss with you with certain latest examples published in New York Times very recently in the 2018, where you can go through the link to verify the exact details. What we try to understand international trade and tariffs is the following, where Trump government, especially in US, is written by Gregory Mankiw as one of the topmost economists in the world, who is famous for macroeconomic analysis. There are many papers and also for international trade, where Trump administration actually imposed a tariff on the solar panel, which is given in the picture. In the solar panel, that has caused a major case for concern to the economists in America, as if there are lots of confusion lies with the Trump administration. So, let us examine that to understand trade theories in detail. To start with 18th century Scotland, where the birth of systematic economics discussion made by Professor Adam Smith in his writing through a book called An Enquiry into the Nature and Causes of Wealth of Nations. That was the case we are referring to late 18th century. And the cases were referred in the context of Scotland and England. Now, what we also try to summarize before going to start with the lecture in detail, or what are the bullet points of understanding for trade, is with the fact that trade by assumption for some of the countries may not be with jack of all trade. That means, some countries may not be having or are possessed with all resources, or they may not be having with the characteristics of jack of all trade. This is simply a myth. A country is too developed does not mean the country is actually possessing all kind of economies. So, the case of free trade is one of the major themes, one of the major themes of discussing trade theories. Now, Smith argued, Adam Smith argued that all nations that trade among nations is like trade among people. So, trade not necessarily just exchange of goods and services. So, trade also promote interactions among different cultures and people. He also emphasized the trade among people. So, so no one feels compelled to sew his own clothes and grow his own food simply because of keeping the person himself or herself busy. So, instead what we could do, we find employment doing what we do best and rely on other people for most goods and services. Why is it so? Because let us deal with the cases where people certainly do their best on some specific goods or services. If we try to define as jack of all trade, probably we cannot optimize that aspect. So, therefore, nations should specialize in producing what they do best and freely trade, as propagated by that school of thought in the 18th century. So, these simultaneously help in specializing as well as help in consumption needs of different countries. This argument was substantiated further by David Ricardo, and also David Ricardo counteracted by emphasizing it with the evidences of 19th century, where he says that jack of all trade is not the answer always behind trade. What we need, if one nation does everything, what David Ricardo says, if one nation does everything better than another, is there any trade possible? In this regard, Ricardo used England and Portugal as an example to verify if one country has advantages in all the products. Especially Portugal was better than England in producing wine. Portugal is better than that of England in producing wine and cloth. If Portugal had a larger advantage in wine production, Portugal should export wine and import cloth. So, now here the important factor is where do we have larger advantage. If the advantage is wines, certainly it is suggested for the countries to specialize in those products. So, therefore, Portugal for wine and England for cloth, so that there will be mutual possible trade and trade takes place. The same principle was also applies to people, since Adam Smith categorically mentioned trade is not necessarily for goods and services, it connects to people. Now, to verify another examples, to make it too lucid to the understanding, if Roger Federer, who is famous for tennis, and Roger Federer, if engage himself for his lawn to mow his lawn faster than anyone else, if he engage himself for mowing his lawns, then his major time he actually engage in preparing his lawns. Rather what we expect, if another gardener or the person who is quite specialized in mowing the lawn correctly and can save the time for Roger Federer. So, that court will be ready, and that much of time Roger Federer can spend for his own specialization and to specialize and to articulate in tennis. So, which will be actually making Roger Federer much better competitive advantage than that of any other player. So, therefore, we must derive cases where some categories of people can specialize in some sections. So, therefore, David Ricardo is famous for identifying comparative cost advantage, where one product should be actually specialized. Where in the early school of thought, the specialization aspects were not emphasized to that extent. Who is David Ricardo? He was not merely a theorist, he was also a successful stock trader and also a parliamentarian, member of parliament, who used to talk about and fought for making the trade free, and often opposed for corn laws which was imposed for restricting grain imports So, Ricardo is a mercantilist actually who involved himself in stock trading, but actually he is a strong believer of free trade. So, therefore, he identified some of the cases where free trade is possible. So, more recently to understand the trade over time, many other theories emphasized productivity is the factor behind the recent days trade, especially referring to Mellie's work, Mark Mellie's work. When a nation opens up to trade, most productive firm expands, whereas the least one actually suffers and forced out of increased competition. So, that is one of the major contribution of Mellie's, and therefore, we are supposed to understand many aspects of controversies related to whether trade actually is beneficial for the developing countries context or less developing countries context, since it facilitates larger firms arguments, firms vis-a-vis small firms arguments, smaller firms arguments, firms arguments are very important for developing countries context. Since in developing countries, especially in India, a very large number of more than 92% enterprises are more than 92% enterprises are informal, and they are very tiny so far as their total gross output is concerned, or their gross capital is concerned, or their number of employees are concerned. In all those three regards, we have huge cases of infirmity in our setups. So, all what he also suggested, as resources move from the least to the most productive firms, overall productivity rises. So, countries productivity rise, but that does not mean it will actually justify the distribution. That is another concern over the time. So, what to believe then? First we said theories suggested something. Is it believable always? Is it necessarily to believe? Unless we do not have evidences, we need not believe theory. We simply say these are just theory. So, to examine those theories, many other economists like Sachs and Warner from in their 1995 paper, they found that open economies grew significantly faster than closed ones. So, that means trade facilitates countries, and those countries which are open in nature, it actually helps the country to grow faster. Now, similarly, one approach is examined by this, we said that open trade enjoy greater prosperity. And second set of approach which said that what happens when closed economies remove their trade restrictions. When firstly we said openness actually help the country to grow, but second one, if the closed economy simply opens the restrictions, is it going to create some problems or not. Now, the result has been an increase in growth rates due to open up, which I have already said. Especially, so there are some examples as verified by different literature, different economists. Japan, in Japan case in 1950 are added to the developed countries list, South Korea in 1960, then Vietnam very recently in the 1990s. So, those countries who opened up their trade actually gained significantly. So, where is the caveat then? Where is the caveat? Where is the borderline? Where is the limit by which the country must actually follow? Now, in this context, we are supposed to understand the caveat through government policies, where to restrict and where to interfere to the market, so that things must be moving, opening of the context with little checks and balances. Now, in this context, Frankel and Romer, Frankel of Harvard and Professor Romer who is also famous for endogenous growth. Romer is from University of California, Berkeley, focuses on geographic proximity. They in their piece of papers, they emphasized geographic disadvantages are actually attached to the context of international trade. Especially for example, New Zealand is disadvantaged compared to Belgium, because it is farther from other populous countries. New Zealand is an island country, so I mean do not have that much of proximity to other populous countries. So, populous countries has a potentialities to create the base for demand. So, which is lagged highly in New Zealand as against Belgium. Similarly, other landlocked countries, there are many landlocked countries are actually disadvantaged, which were actually emphasized. So, directly or indirectly, whether country promotes trade or country do not promote trade, not necessarily it is the fault of the country, it might be also due to many other reasons. Now, since this what kind of questions guys you are going to expect from all 4 lectures previously. Every time we are trying to understand what are the exact reasons behind trade, and the theories actually try to emphasize the reasons, the factors based on various contexts observed by different economists. So, theories are actually developed based on the experiences by the experts in their different context. So, I mean if I just try to understand what could be the questions here. Now, the question is, first question is which are the myths, what are the myths in trade theories. Is trade actually beneficial always? Is trade is creating a context of zero sum game, and is it having I mean is it the fact that all the countries must open up always for the case of benefits. So, you need to verify from different slides. Now, what are the rationales from data further? Especially economists derive confounding factors, as I already discussed, all other related factors which are very much closely connected to the trade and to the geographic characteristics of the country, that must not be neglected. Then after analyzing the data, Frankel and Romer in their work they found that a rise of 1% point in the ratio of trade to GDP increases income per person at least 1/2%. So, half the percent actually increases in GDP. GDP increased by half the percent, 0.5% increase if there is 1% rise in trade, rise in export plus import. If this implies 0.5% rise in GDP. So, in their work is also it has been proved that trade is actually helpful. So, in other words, nations should take the theories of Smith, Ricardo and Melis, which I have already said, who are the strong believer of opening of trade. With opening of trade with no restrictions, that is prima facie proved through theories. So, free trade not always not good always as pointed out by some experts, they are trying to emphasize in the context of time. Time is the factor. It might hurt some of the expanding some of the countries who are expanding, and it hurts for the developing countries, especially in the short run, and especially for the import competing sectors. Those sectors, those areas of developing countries or the emerging countries who are competing with the imports. And the concerns are also important for new jobs which might be at risk in those sectors. So, therefore, the country must go for robust safety and effective safety net and effective retraining of their own resources, own employment or returning jobs. If it does not undermine the conclusion that free trade raises average standard of living, then what else? Now, after analyzing Trump's policies, which was a case for concern for the economists in US in 2018, especially for solar panel and the import tariff, which I started the discussion for it. Now, it must have been understood to us that what should the government do. Now, in this context, should we impose a tariff on Americans vacationing at Scotland's, especially Trump international golf links? Should we impose a tariff on Americans vacationing, or should vacationers make their consumption choices free from the hand of government? Now, so the administration be very cautious about imposing any kind of tariff. So, tariff is actually, if the sentiment of the country is very good and they have very good fundamentals, why should we impose tariff? So, the economists largely were not supporting Trump's strategy of imposition of import tariffs in certain segments. Then why is trade good? The question always comes. We have already said many times, it is a combination of capitalism and free trade. So, the concentration of power may be getting distributed to other hands due to free trade, and it generates wealth. So, it has been observed that it has huge trickle down effects. Billions of people around the world actually have been lifted out of poverty line. So, there are many cases. Those are 19th century trade patterns majorly guided by beggar thy neighbor economic nationalism. You beggar, making the beggar poor strategies are though there, but the industrial revolution in the 19th century has actually carried forward to many developed other countries, especially development of middle class sections. Now, two ideas remain central to the theory of international trade more than 200 years. The ideas is that there must be free trade, and free trade may be based on absolute advantage, absolute cost advantage, or may be through comparative cost advantage. Cost advantage. Those two ideas as propagated by Smith and Ricardo actually have been valid for over 200 years later, since their suggestions to the economies. So, in his seminal work The Wealth of Nations of Adam Smith taught countries to concentrate their efforts on producing goods and selling goods in which they have absolute advantage, which I was just talking about. Now, in the recent times, if you try to collect facts, China, modern day China, the recent China has absolute advantage in especially for cheap labor cost over most Western nations for manufacturing. What happens when a country has absolute advantage in multiple industries? We are actually referring to the context of comparative cost advantage by David Ricardo, which I have discussed a couple of minutes back. So, classical theory does not work, however, always work in practice, does not work always in practice. What we try to say, unfettered capitalism across borders still creates winners and losers. If I just sum it off all the previous slides, posing thorny social and political consequences. Now, since it has double impacts, we are exposed to have major social and political questions, especially for the policy makers, where dry economy models may not help or cannot help. So, we are now in a situation of understanding its consequences and for the policymakers it raises several questions further. So, it is as a short history for protectionism. We have observed that in the 18th and 19th century proposed by the trade theories proposed by David Ricardo as against the proposition made by mercantilism were continued for 200 years. So, especially in the mercantilism period where restrictions were actually proposed for the sake of growing their own country's development. Now, Romans prohibited the cultivation of wine beyond the Alps, and the ancient Greeks imposed 5% duties on all parts in their empire. I mean, if I am just counting down some of the facts before the 18th century trade. So, Navigation Act was there where it restricted trade as well. So, key moment came with the abolition of Corn Laws in 1846, that is a standard period referred as the period started with free trade. Now, similarly, the smoothening of the trade actually started counted over the time, especially when the big institutions are developed after World War II, Second World War, and because of World Bank, IMF, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT) were instituted in 1947. Later on, it was the GATT was renamed to WTO in 1995. China became the member since 2001, but since the inception from 1995, India has been the founding member of WTO. So, we have discussed many things before this. You may read all other examples here for the understanding of the birth of WTO or the institution over the time. So, is free trade always the answer? We have already discussed, but one thing to be emphasized here is lobbying strategies by the bigger firms. So, it raises a political economic question. So, it is the vested interest of the powerful groups or the bigger firms which facilitates trades, and at the sake of other small firms or the industries. So, therefore, domestic producer can be squeezed out by global rivals with huge economy of scale due to the connections. So, therefore, what we try to mention, we need not emphasize these are further examples to our earlier understanding. So, what India should do? India actually in the recent time, India should not be worried too much. India though have been member from the beginning of WTO, we have huge threats against China. China is the is having strongest point in manufacturing, but India should not worry because of the fact that we have huge other advantage in other sectors, and our export boxes are very complementary rather than competitive edge against China. So, we should not worry so much for the Chinese rise. So, these are all background to trade theories to start with. In our next class, we are going to talk about mercantilism theory, and next class it will be of absolute cost advantage. With this, let me stop here. We will carry for our rest of the details to the next class in detail for mercantilism theory, where we will talk about the restriction in detail. So, thank you so much. We will continue.